Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today, actively listening or actively participating in this Big Book Telephone 12-step workshop. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome. We start out with an intention of having an open mind and an open heart and a full realization that we can't open it, either our mind or our heart, sufficiently. So we're asking for intervention, whether that's from your higher self, your true self, your human spirit, or the Holy Spirit. Those are decisions that you have made and will make, certainly formally in step 2. Meanwhile, join me in a prayer for that intervention, the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference, wisdom to see reality as it is, and to discern what I can influence and what I can't influence. So we have had an orientation, and we took some time with that because it's really important that we understand the commitment, our own personal time commitment, and getting a rhythm as to what that might look like on a weekly basis. Most of us probably underestimated the time commitment, because it's not just an hour and a half for the call, but it's probably anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, depending on where we're at in the assignments, of supplemental work, meaning the reading of the book, the reflection, asking the questions, the writing, your own time and discernment. And we have started step 1. It has 3 parts as I have experienced it now. It wasn't the intention of Bill Wilson nor the Big Book to create an approach to the first step that I'm articulating for you, presenting for your journey. Bill really focused on the first half of the first step. The doctor's opinion asked the question, what's wrong with my body? And it was his opinion that we have a biological problem. We know today from science that that's actually true. It's been validated. Our DNA and our biochemistry is different. Once we start, we cannot stop. But a more important aspect was alluded to by Dr. Silkworth, who is a psychiatrist, was a psychiatrist, but never really expanded much on it. And Bill expanded on it. And we spent a lot of time looking at pages 23 to 43, asking the questions, so what does Bill and the Big Book have to say about the mental defectiveness? He shows us the experience, of course, of Jim, the car salesman, and Fred, the accountant, to demonstrate that we have a susceptibility, a vulnerability, an unusual, a unique deficiency in our mind, vulnerable to an obsession that is a delusion, vulnerable to a thought that is a lie. And we don't know it, we don't see it, and we don't discern it, and we don't learn from it. Fred captures it, as we talked about last week, the strange mental blank spot. And each of us has had the experience of not learning from our repetitive negative consequences. Repeating behavior as if it's going to be different, as if it's going to be better, and it always is different, it never is better, and different meaning that it's getting worse. Certainly different than what we expected. But these are the two characteristics of powerlessness concerning our addiction. The first half of the first step. The first half of the first step, the part before the dash. Having two component parts, our mind and our body. But now we're crossing the dash. And we're looking at unmanageability. At the end of looking at the first half of the first step on page 43, Bill very clearly says, we have no mental defense against the first drink. We need a power other than ourselves. Then he enters into step 2. That's the intended structure of the big book. But that's not the structure that we're following. A man who was very creative, out of the box, had a very different experience. And when he crossed over the dash, led by his own teacher, his own sponsor, his own step guide, he unpacked what is unmanageability. Bill includes that in parts of chapter 4 and 5, but not with the kind of intention that we have. We're taking a look at it as part of step 1, and we will take a look at the behavioral description of unmanageability in the bedevilments in page 52. And then page 60 to 62 captures a description of the exact nature of the unmanageability. Where does it come from? What causes it? What's its source? What's its very essence and nature? Which is absolutely captured in the conclusion on page 62, those first two paragraphs. At the beginning of the first paragraph on page 62, Bill says, selfishness dash self-centeredness exclamation point. It's not even, I mean, it's a complete sentence, but it doesn't have a verb. He wants to give it that kind of silver bullet power. Selfishness dash self-centeredness exclamation point. Then he clarifies, this is the root of our problem. It's not a, it's a description attempting to give us the exact nature of the problem. At the core of the core of the core of unmanageability is the explanation that our will is as deficient as our mind is as deficient as our body. In the same way that our body cannot successfully process the chemical, whatever that is in the addiction, whether that be substance or process, and our mind cannot successfully process reality, certainly around our addiction, but even broader than that, and that's our experience. Our mind is defective, our will is defective, and Bill now is going to unpack for us our will is defective. My body cannot successfully process alcohol. Herb is an alcoholic. My mind cannot successfully process reality, but my will is defective in a very unusual way. And it's the human condition, not the addict condition. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. St. Paul had that complaint in the Christian scripture. He called it his thorn. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. I think he was talking about the human condition. The Catholic tradition has a way of approaching that very thing, Adam and Eve and the apple, and that whole metaphorical story about attempting to explain the deficiency of human nature. And they called it original sin, the origin of sin. And now we know that the word sin, as in fact used in the Aramaic, merely means missing the mark. A much more gentle term than most of us had been exposed to in our religious traditions, I'm assuming. Sin, merely missing the mark. How gentle is that? And so we start off taking a look at page 45 in this approach, this creative approach, not intended by the big book. The big book and Bill Wilson intended chapter 4 to follow his explanation of the addiction and the powerlessness and no choice on page 43, no mental defense, we need a power other than ourselves. And he began chapter 4 right after that, meaning to give us an entrance into step 2, and then eventually step 3. But I'm taking the cue from the third step guide that I had, Joe Hawk, and I'm using the beginning of chapter 4 as a conclusion to the first half of the first step. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism, powerlessness, addiction. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic, the addict, and the non-alcoholic, the non-addict. And now he's going to give us the 2 ingredients that I just talked about. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if, when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take. He puts the obsession first, the mind problem, and then addresses the allergy phenomenon of craving problem, the body problem. And he uses the term or, not and, either or. And if you have that experience, he says, you're probably an addict, you're probably an alcoholic. Well, of course, he is intending to address step 2, so he talks about atheism and agnosticism, which we won't do here. We'll wait until we get to step 2. But the end of that paragraph, he says, to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis. You see, we're at the fork in the road. If we're powerless over the addiction, we can't stop when we start, and we can't stay stopped once we stop. We're doomed. We're hopeless. That's the prayed for, hoped for experience in step 1 as a platform for then looking for power. We need to live on a spiritual basis. It's not an easy alternative to face, he says, hoping against hope. If a mere code of morals, that is a code of behavior, like the 10 Commandments, for instance, or a better philosophy of life, meaning knowledge. So he's addressing our behavior and our knowledge. If they were sufficient, many of us would have recovered long ago. Most of us are self-help junkies, both in terms of books and workshops and seminars and exposure, training, coaches, all the rest of it. But it didn't work because those are human solutions to a human but spiritual problem. We found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. So now he's making a shift here. This is really, please pay attention. He's addressed the body and the mind in his conclusion, looking over his shoulder in that first paragraph. But now, looking forward, he's giving us a whole new development. We could wish to be moral, meaning behave properly. We could wish to be philosophically comforted, that is, know better. In fact, now here's where he makes the transition. We could will these things with all our might. He is for the very first time introducing willpower. The two components, as I've mentioned many times, that make us specifically human. One is that we have a mind that knows and thinks, and that we have a free will that makes decisions and takes voluntary actions. Those are the functions coming from our cortex, the final development of the brain. The first development being biological survival in the brain stem. The second development, eons, millions of years of evolution, being the limbic system, creating the emotions, again, for our survival instincts. And then many millions of years later, the cortex develops, in which human beings are human specifically because they have a mind that knows and can know that it knows it can transcend itself. And it has free will. We're the only reality that has those two abilities. The ability to self-reflect and the ability to take completely voluntary action. And they're the key to recovery. These two components of what makes us specifically human. We could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. The needed willpower. Our human resources, perhaps body and mind, as marshaled by the will, the third component, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. So he's again telling us, like the body, inherently flawed. Like the mind, inherently flawed. The will itself is inherently flawed. He's not telling us what that is yet. He's just saying there's something basically wrong with human nature, not with the addict. We already discussed that. But this is now representative of 100% of human beings, human nature, as I've learned to apply it. So then he asks the question about we need a lack of power is our dilemma. And in line with his intent of going into step 2, he says, so we need to find a power by which we could live. Notice he doesn't say by which we could deal with our addiction. He's really talking about manageability and unmanageability, the second half of the first step, by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously, but where and how are we going to find this power? You see, at the beginning of a new section, he's going to give us 2 very powerful questions. And he continues to practice that literary style throughout his journey through each of the steps. At the beginning of a new section, he stands on the path and he looks back over his shoulder at where we've been and he gives us a recap. And then he looks forward and he gives us a little bit of a context and a projection, basically using a couple questions to ask us to ask ourselves, and then he will unfold the answer to that as we read the subsequent pages. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable me to find a power greater than myself, which will solve my problem. Oh, what's my problem? No, it's not your addiction. He just said, lack of power is your problem. Lack of power is my problem. Lack of power is the human problem. Well, what does it mean? And this man took me to page 52. And he says, this is what it looks like behaviorally. This is a behavioral description of unmanageability, page 52. And he had me do 2 things. Number 1, he had me look up the word bedevilment because that's at the conclusion of the paragraph. And we called it the bedevilment paragraph as a result of that. But he also had me, after reading it as written in the big book, he had me reread it, crossing out the we's, the plurals, and making it personal, and crossing out the past and making it present. I'm 10 years sober when I'm having this assignment. I've already had 2 powerful spiritual awakenings, 3 years earlier, 6 years earlier, respectively. Mind and the body. I've had a progressive experience with step 1. I got sober in 84. I had my first experience with the big book and the steps in having an awareness and an experience of the doctor's opinion that something's wrong with my body. And then it was 3 years later that I had another journey through the steps, and I had a new experience with there's something wrong with my mind. But here I am now in 1994, having my 3rd journey with a new step guide, and I'm having a new experience. This man, Joe Hawk, had given me the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer, and I do really believe that that was the primer that set me up. But then it was his own special talent and technique of leading me creatively through this particular assignment that gave me a brand new experience as to, number 1, understanding unmanageability, and number 2, having an experience of powerlessness, no choice, with regard to my will, which I thought was free. And it is free, but in some respects, it's not free at all. And so when I use the present tense and the personal pronoun, then it went like this. I have to ask myself why I shouldn't apply to my human problems. See, not my addict problem, my human problem. This same readiness to change my point of view, the set-aside attitude. I am having trouble with personal relationships. Notice, personal pronoun, present tense. I crossed it off and I read it to myself, and then I read it out loud twice. This was his instruction to me. To read it out loud was, I think, the crossing over the bridge, because it had its way with me. After I had studied it, revised it, read it to myself personally, prayed about it, meditated about it, and then reading it out loud. I am having trouble with personal relationships. 10 years sober, 25 years married, and wanting a divorce. I can't control my emotional nature. I was filled with remorse and regret for my past. I am a prey to misery and depression. Not so much. I'm a very positive person, probably Pollyannish in some ways, and kind of naive probably in some ways. I can't make a living. I took it into meditation and I said, wait. I have a terrific career. I make a decent amount of money. I have a local reputation and sometimes even a national reputation. What does this mean? I can't make a living. And the wee small voice speaks to us when we get silent and we ask an accurate question that we really do want the answer to. And the wee small voice quietly said, Herb, you can't make a living that satisfies you because you're never satisfied. You're a bottomless pit. There's not enough power, pleasure, adulation, recognition, fun, money, is there? There's not enough spirituality, is there? You're a bottomless pit, always wanting more. We get quiet and we ask a question. And if we listen, we will hear something. I interpret it as that wee small voice of the spirit deep in me that is a spirit other than me, but available to me. I have a feeling of uselessness. I am full of fear. I am unhappy. I can't seem to be of real help to other people. And I challenged it. I don't just take these things lightly. I think about them deeply. Well, wait a minute. I studied to be a Catholic priest, a missionary. That was all about helping people. After that didn't seem to work out, I studied psychology so that I could become a therapist. If I couldn't save your soul, I would at least try to help heal your mind. And I did all the human development of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to be a better human being and to make my contribution in the world. And now I'm sober and I'm sponsoring people. How does this apply to me? I said to myself. And I got quiet. And the wee small voice said, Herb, you really don't want to help people. You don't want to take the time and spend the energy and get your hands dirty. You really don't want to do that. What you really want is the reputation of helping people. That's not a subtle distinction, and I hope you have a little smile on your face. It was embarrassing to me. At the same time, I'm in therapy with my good friend Alan Berger, who now literally is a friend and co-facilitator. But he was a wonderful analytic and confrontive therapist. And he was exposing me to, helping me to see my own narcissism, a character defect, a personality disorder, which fit completely compatible with this whole bedevilment issue, as well as the selfishness, self-centeredness, which Bill says is at the root of it. And so we go to page 60, in which Bill talks about that. Now, again, this is chapter 5, how it works, and Bill did not intend it to be part of step 1, but this man included it as part of his exposure to and explanation of unmanageability, which he called the spiritual malady. On page 60, he says the first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. And he had me write that as a question. Am I convinced? And he said, once you finish the assignment on unmanageability, answer the question. Hold the question while you're doing the assignment. Take that statement, turn it into a question, and answer it at the end of the assignment. Are you now convinced? On that basis, we are almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. And then page 61 and 62 elaborate on that. I would like to come back to that page 61 next time, as we're giving a context to our workshop next week. But I do want to come to page 62 to begin to unpack what I had started with at the beginning, that unmanageability is a spiritual malady. Unmanageability is the human condition, the human brokenness, not just the addict. And on page 62, he says, selfishness dash self-centeredness, as I mentioned, exclamation point. That we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity. See, these are the fruits of the root. The root is self-centeredness, meaning it's a survival orientation. I'm not judging it negatively. I'm explaining its biological, psychological, sociological, survival purpose. Our self-centeredness is a legitimate orientation for our very survival in the beginning. Unfortunately, we become habituated, especially perhaps because of our addiction, to that self-centeredness and the immediate gratification. And once we start using compulsively, addictively, we stop growing emotionally. That's science now. It's conclusive. If you started your addiction at age 16, until you came into recovery, you were still underdeveloped in your emotions as a 16-year-old would. And it's interesting about the brain. We know this now from the works by like people like Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist at UCLA, that what we didn't know 15 years ago, all his work on the brain now has revealed that the brain continues to develop into our mid-20s. The final growth of the cortex and neocortex, the development, doesn't happen until right around 25, 26, 27 years old. But there's not going to be the kind of intended organic growth if, in fact, we're using some form of addiction in our body and in our to damage our emotions. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation. Notice seemingly. We have a delusion that we're a victim. You will appreciate these sentences much more after you've done step 4. Right now, it might be just an interesting, maybe even embarrassing concept. We invariably find that at some time in the past, we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. I don't have a role in my disturbance. I don't have a role in my resentment. I don't have a part. I do not have a part in my resentments. I'm clearly seeing it. I'm clearly convinced. I don't have a part. I have 100%, not a part. 100% of my perceptions, my thoughts, my feelings, and especially my behavior are my responsibility and have determined the life that I have today. This is very confrontive. You have exactly the life that you've earned by your thoughts and your feelings and your perceptions and your behavior. Today, your life is exactly as you created it. Oh, that sounds like awful bad news. And yet, it's the truth, 100% reality. And the good news is, well, if I created this, then in fact, I can take some actions, get some knowledge that will in fact be the antidote to bringing it to healing. Not quickly, not by Monday, but down the road as I pursue this path of recovery and healing. And this is why he says on page 62, so our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. Again, we will have a technicolor appreciation of that line once we've completed our 4th step. Because the whole purpose of the 4th step is to bring us to an experience that our resentments have come from us. Our fears have come from us. Our sexual behavior and dishonesty and secrets and guilt and shame have all originated in ourselves as a reaction to circumstances and people. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. All human beings are examples of self-will run riot. All human beings. But he says the addict is a special brand, and that's probably because of our addiction. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. The implication here. I'm powerless over my self-centeredness. To remove it. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without God's aid. Just confirming that thought. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore. We knew better and we didn't do better, despite our value system, and our knowledge. But we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. Even though we would have liked to. With our willpower, we really tried. But our willpower was not strong enough or effective enough. Now here's the wooden stake in the heart. In the same way he ended on page 43, the alcoholic has no mental defense against the first drink, talking about the first half of the first step. Now at the conclusion of the discussion on unmanageability, the deficiency of the will, extreme example of self-will run riot, self-centeredness, he brings us to that conclusion of powerlessness, which is the springboard to step 2. Listen to it. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. Neither could we. He said we had to get rid of it, and we couldn't. God made that possible. But now he takes it a step further. We can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power. The same conclusion he had for the first half of the first step on page 43. We need God's help. Now he brings it here to the second half of the first step. Unmanageability. We need God's help. This is now preparing us for step 2. Next week, we'll talk again about step 1, unmanageability. We'll take a deeper look at pages 60, 61, and 62 because it warrants it. Now you have a perspective on it. It might have a little bit more juice for you to lead you to an experience of it. Assignment 5 captures the instructions on bringing you through each of the pieces. And the final piece of that in assignment 5 is to complete the worksheet on the mind, not again as a right or wrong test. Absolutely, there are no right answers. And you'll see that worksheet essentially are just listing those bedevilments that we looked at. I looked it up in a dictionary and it said to be controlled as if by devils. Another mental image I have of it is I'm a puppet on strings that are tied to outside circumstances and outside people. And circumstances and people, I thought, were the things that jerked me around. And I was a victim of circumstances and people. And to the extent that I extended the string and tied the knots, it is true. And step 4 allows us to cut those strings. Step 4 allows us to see the delusion of our victimhood. Step 4 allows us to take full responsibility for our thinking, our feeling, our perceptions, and especially our behavior. But it's only after we do steps 2 and 3 where we then have a decision about power in step 2 and a decision for our relationship with power in step 3. And so the assignment for next week is to continue with the work on assignment 5. And if you can finish it with the completion of the will worksheet, I think that will be in your interest, and we'll see how we do next week with the continued discussion on step 1. Now I'd like to have a discussion with you, bringing you onto the line to talk about your work in the steps, especially this material on unmanageability, beginning with page 45, or any aspect of it that you want to address. Let's pray conclusion, the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.